The Lord said to him, "Go up." So David said, "Where shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, "It was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul." David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you. And I also will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now, therefore, let your hands be strong and be valiant. For Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, even over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Now, let the young men arise and hold a contest before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So they arose and went over by count, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. Each one of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called Helkath Hazarim, which is in Gibeon. That day the battle was very severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. Asahel pursued Abner and did not turn to the right or to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." So Abner said to him, "Turn to your right or to your left, and take hold of one of the young men for yourself, and take for yourself his spoil." But Asahel was not willing to turn aside from following him. Abner repeated again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the belly with the butt end of the spear, so that the spear came out at his back, and he fell there and died on the spot. And it came about that all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which is in front of Giah, by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. The sons of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became one band, and they stood on the top of a certain hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers?" And Joab said, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. Abner and his men then went through the Arabah all that night. So they crossed the Jordan, walked all morning, and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab returned from following Abner. When he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants besides Asahel were missing. But the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. And they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night until the day dawned at Hebron.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Fred. We are in 2 Samuel today. If you are new or visiting with us, we just started a chapter-by-chapter study of this book, and today we'll be looking at the chapter we just read, so I encourage you to have an open Bible to get the most out of our time. When was the last time that you thought to yourself, "Man, if only I had waited"? You know, you buy the laptop and the next week it goes on sale. Or maybe you send the text message before you really know the whole story. We all know that feeling. Sometimes it's just for a moment. It's not a big deal. But sometimes that feeling can linger because the stakes are much higher. An impulsive purchase straps you into a long-term debt, and every time you make that payment, you feel it. Or a moment of lust gives way to fornication, and you have to spend the years carrying the baggage of that moment. How often do we sit in the aftermath of our hasty choices and think to ourselves, "If only I had waited"? Impatience is the mother of mistakes and the father of regret. And it can lead some very smart people to do some very dumb things. And in 2 Samuel chapter 2 today, we will see a sobering story about the dangers of impatience. In this chapter that we just read, we will see David become anointed, and immediately he will be opposed. And this opposition will be the result in tension, and the tension will result in conflict, and the conflict will result in fighting, and the fighting will result in death. And by the end of the story, there will be people standing in graveyards, digging graves for their own sons, and wondering, "If only we had waited on the Lord." Some of you may be at that crossroads today. Inside your heart is eaten up with discontentment. And deep down your heart is telling you, don't just stand there, do something. My friends, the message of 2 Samuel 2 this morning, that God's word to you may be simply this: don't just do something, stand there. Be patient. How often we are the ones who are in a hurry when God never is. In fact, the last time I checked, He literally has all the time in the universe. And in this text, He wants to remind us of how important it is in 2 Samuel 2 that we wait on the Lord. Before we jump into this text, I need to clarify a few things. Real simple, real quick, but please pay attention. First of all, this is an Old Testament story, and it's helpful to know that Bible stories don't tell you the message. They often show you the message. So you have to pay attention to the people, the places, and the action to know why God included the story there. It's not as obvious as in other places. Which leads me to number 2. If you noticed in the reading earlier, there's a lot of people in this story. And most of their names start with A, unfortunately. And it can be kind of confusing. Some are good guys, some are bad guys. Fair warning, some good guys become bad guys, some bad guys become good guys. It gets complicated real quick. But number 3, if you notice, there's also a lot of places in this story. And the geography, I'm convinced, is actually one of the characters in the story. So you got to kind of know who and where to see what the author's showing us. So if you want to think of the sermon today like a map, you know how every map has a legend, right? Like a little key. So here's the key today, right? That means good guy. That means bad guy. That means north. And that means south. All right? So if you can follow those simple directions, it'll help us stay oriented in what's kind of a confusing story to help us see what the author's showing us. Now let's begin. Verse 1. It says, "Then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord." You say afterwards, after what? Well, after the death of Saul. By the way, if you're totally new to the Bible, you need to know this. Saul, bad guy. David, good guy. So here, Saul is dead. He's mourned him. He's been buried. And I don't know about you, but if I were David, this is the point where I would be thinking, finally. Right? He's been waiting 13 years for this moment. If I was David, I would have been saying, Saul is gone. Let's get this show on the road. But David does something different. He's not impulsive. He's submissive. He asks of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah?" David was living outside of Israel in Philistine territory, and so God tells him to go to a place, if you notice there, called Hebron. Now, it's in the south, so David has to travel north, but he's still in the south. He comes to this place called Hebron. Now, Hebron is an important city, and there's lots I could say about it, but what you really need to know is this. Hebron is the place that Sarah and Abraham are buried. The story of Abraham kind of haunts or looms in the background of this chapter. It's as if God is tying in Israel's patriarch with Israel's monarch. Abraham received a promise, David's received a promise, and they both wind up at Hebron. And here it says in that verse, David's question is, "Shall I go up?" And by the way, look again where it says, "And the Lord said, go up." And David said, "Shall I go up?" And he says, "Yes, to Hebron." So David went up. Do you hear the repetition there? That's how Bible stories work. They repeat ideas so that you can see them. So what's happening? David's going up. Well, he's topographically going up. Hebron is located higher in terms of elevation, but there's something more there. David is also moving up in the world. He is actually ascending to the throne. It's not quick. It's going to take some time, but he is slowly but surely going up to fulfill the very promise that God had made. We learn in verses 2 and 3 that he brings his wives and soldiers with him and their families, which means this was a permanent move. This was not, David's been a vagabond kind of running around the Middle East. Now he's setting up his headquarters at Hebron. And there he receives a very warm welcome. Verse 4, "Then the men of Judah came and there anointed David king over the house of Judah." Now, if you were here in 1 Samuel, you're saying, wait a minute, I thought David was already anointed. Well, he was anointed king privately at the house of Jesse, his father. Here is the first of 2 public anointings, and this is over the house of Judah, which, by the way, is David's tribe. In fact, it's the only tribe at this point that's involved. So David's recognized as his own tribe. And his first order of business there in verses 4 through 7, he reaches out to the men of Jabesh Gilead. Now, again, you may remember this. If you don't, it's kind of important to the story here. Jabesh, Saul, remember, bad guy. When Saul, one of the good things that he did was this town of Jabesh Gilead, they were going to be attacked by this guy named Nahash, the snake king. You might remember that. Anyhow, he was going to come attack them, and Saul risked his life to deliver them. Now, Saul's been killed by the Philistines, and they actually took his headless corpse and paraded it through the streets of Philistia, of the various cities, and the people of Jabesh-Gilead said, wait a minute, Saul risked his life for us, we're now going to risk our life for him. And they snuck in to get his body to give it a proper burial. And so recognizing that they sort of aligned themselves with Saul, David reaches out to them and says, now, hey, I just want you guys to realize you were loyal to Saul, and everybody knows I was always loyal to Saul. I didn't kill him. And by the way, may God be loyal to you. And then he ends with verse 7, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. In other words, David says, and may we be loyal to each other. Now, what makes this significant, I'll tell you why this is brilliant, because where's David? Watch this. He's in Hebron in the south. Guess where Jabesh-Gilead is? It's in the north. In fact, you can't get more north without leaving the promised land. So David strategically uses this moment to hand an olive branch, if you will, to one of the furthest northern cities to say, hey, we have this common bond. You looked out for Saul. I'm going to look out for you. I'm becoming king way down here in the south. Hopefully we can work something out. David is slowly but cautiously being diplomatic and starting to bring the north and the south together. Then notice what happens in verse 8. It says, but Abner. I think that should read, meanwhile. There's some intrigue here. Abner, the son of Ner, by the way, watch this, bad guy, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. Verse 9, he made him king. Now, notice where he does this. He makes him king at Mahanaim. You say, I don't know where that is. I told you I'd help you out. David's down here in Hebron. He sends word up to Jabesh-Gilead. Mahanaim is in the north, and it's like right next door to Jabesh-Gilead. You can almost imagine in this moment that Abner sitting at home and hears, hey, did you see that David sent some guys from way down south, way up north, and they're right across the street? And Abner went, uh-oh, what's going on? What does David think he's doing? No, we've got to do something about this. And so Abner springs into action, and he takes the last remaining son of Saul, Ishbosheth, and he made him king. He puts his puppet on the throne. Now notice, unlike David, in his anointing, there's no mention of the Lord there. The Lord prompted what happened at Hebron, but not here. This is all Abner's idea. And Abner makes him king, notice verse 9, over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and even over all Israel. So here we find that Abner has his own plan, his own idea to make this happen. Now, there's a little subtle note here, where again, I told you people and places, that he not only put a son of Saul on the throne, the man he made king, he calls him Ishbosheth. Well, if you know, his actual name, 1 Chronicles 9, was Eshbaal, which means son of Baal. The author here gives him a nickname that's very similar, Ishbosheth, which means son of disgrace. It's the author's way of showing us by saying, shame on you. Shame on you, Abner. Shame on you, house of Saul. Shame on you, Eshbaal, for going against the Lord's anointed. You know God's promise. You know what he was going to do through David, and yet you took matters into your own hands? Shame on you, he says. Abner knew the word of God about David, but he was unfaithful to the word of God. He had his own plans, his own timetable. He is a picture of self-reliance. And he's going to learn that unbelief plus impatience equals disaster. Now, what's the author showing us? I think he's showing us here a contrast, but particularly he's showing us that the kingdom of David is like a mustard seed. It's tiny. At first, there's one man, one city, one tribe, one ally, while Ishbosheth has 11 tribes. He has countless cities. He has numerous allies. But the author is showing us, listen, don't be fooled. Ishbosheth, he might have the numbers, but don't forget, David has the promise. And when David has the promise and David has the word of God, oh, it might seem small, it might not seem significant, but when God gets done, it will all be worth it. Some of you may feel that way right now. Your life seems small, that you're in the backwoods place. It's not big and impressive like other people on the internet or your other friends, and you think, boy, my life doesn't count, my life isn't much. You may think, well, I've got this little Bible study in my dorm and there's only 2 people coming to it. Maybe I just shouldn't do it. Maybe it's not even worth it. Have you ever thought that maybe one of those people is the next Billy Graham? My friends, do not despise the day of small beginnings. The mustard seed will grow, even if it starts out small. Don't grow impatient. In fact, David is a wonderful picture of this. Notice verse 11. The time that David was a king in Hebron over the house of Judah was what? 7 years and 6 months. Are you kidding me? 7 more years? We've been waiting for 13 already. And yet David is going to wait another 7. And as we will see, while David is at Hebron and he is content and fine with this, everybody around him, it is driving them crazy. And everybody around him is trying to force things, and they're trying to force the Lord's anointed to be king now, and it's as if David says, my hour has not yet come. And so he goes to Hebron and he waits. Faith sometimes requires us going to Hebron, doing the last thing God told us to do, and being patient. But how often does the Abner inside of us say, I don't have time to wait. I need to go do. I need to make it big. I need to make it impressive. I need to do these things. By the way, it should be noted at this point in the story, David is not involved in the rest of the chapter. His name appears, but he's not involved. Also, if that's not telling enough, guess who else is not involved? God. The Lord is not mentioned again. His name is mentioned, but he's not involved in what happens. And it's as if the author is showing you God and David was being submissive, obedient, and we got to this point, and now everybody runs off without God. They run off without looking to the Lord's anointed, and it's not going to be good. Verse 12, now Abner, the son of Ner, by the way, bad guy, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and Joab, good guy, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out, and they met at the pool of Gibeon. Okay, so get it again. Good guys in the south. Had to think about that. Bad guys in the north. Okay, and they meet at this place, Gibeon. Guess where that is? Smack dab in the middle. Gibeon is to this story what Virginia was to the American Civil War. It's the meeting place of North and South. It's a key battleground place, and unlike the Civil War, it's not where the Civil War ends, it's where the Civil War is going to begin. Abner, it says here, meets up with Joab, and they propose something. Notice verse 14, then Abner said to Joab, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. Now what is that? I think it's a curtain call to the story of David and Goliath. You remember that? Kind of an ancient way of battling things. You send out your champion, I'll send out my champion. They'll fight out, winner takes all. But in this case, it's not mano y mano, it's dose y dose. They each send out 12, and they meet there for this battle. And if you know, by the way, the number 12, kind of full of meaning when it comes to Israel. My translation says contest. Some of yours says let them have a competition or to make sport. It's a really strange word here, and I think it stands out on purpose because he says let them. It's like entertainment, and it's actually the root word in Hebrew, the same root word where we get the word laughter from. And if you know your Old Testament, whose name means laughter? It's Isaac. Who's Isaac? The son of Abraham. It's as if the author is showing you that these 12 representatives, they're meeting in this middle ground to determine who the real sons of Abraham are. Is it the north or is it the south? By the way, we're going to put a pin in that and come back to it. So they go out for whatever this competition is, but things get heated. Verse 16, each of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. And therefore the place was called Helkath Hazarim, or something like we might translate Massacre Memorial Park. Who fell down? The text says all of them did. All 24 of them fell down. So as the reader, we're left wondering, then who is the winner? And that's what the author's trying to show us. Who's the winner? The winner, when God's people fight each other, is nobody wins. When God's people fight each other, we all lose. My friends, how often does our impatience breed unnecessary conflict in our lives? How many of us have started a spat with our spouse because we jumped to conclusions? Or we got into a squabble with a friend or a roommate because we didn't know the whole story, but we were too impatient to figure it out. We were too quick to speak and slow to listen. By the way, this was not just an Old Testament problem. This is a New Testament problem. One of the most important statements on this in the New Testament is, you probably know it, 1 Corinthians 13. It says what? Love is patient. That phrase, let me remind you, was not written for marriage. You know what it was written for? Church members. It was written for a church at Corinth where people were impatient and shoving each other out of the way. I want to go first. I want to use my gifts, and I want the table first. And they were doing this with each other. And Paul says, do you not realize when God's people fight each other, nobody wins? And most of all, the gospel loses. So love must be patient. Do you find your heart getting impatient with that person in your small group you just think talks too much? And you just want to finish their sentence for them just to move things along? Love is patient. Listen, I know, we have you made your way in, we have a very crammed parking lot, okay? Listen, can I just encourage you, don't think of it as a parking problem. Think of it as an opportunity for sanctification. I'm not wrong. I got to get out first. I want that spot, right? I always park there. When God's people fight each other, it's unnecessary conflict. By the way, if you don't believe me the depths of this, let's go back to the pen we put over here in the story of Abraham. Who was Abraham? He was a man that God made a promise to him. God said, I'm going to give you a son. And guess what? Abraham became impatient. And he shacked up with Hagar. And now what happens? All of a sudden, he has a son, Ishmael. And now we have two sons of Abraham who spend their lives warring with each other. And we still look into the Middle East today, and the sons of Abraham are still fighting. Because a man became impatient. The promise of God wasn't enough for him. I gotta do it myself. I've got to figure this thing out. I got to get ahead. I wonder how many times Abraham rolled over in bed at night and whispered into Sarah's ear, if only we had waited. That leads us then to the next scene, a very strange scene. The fight is roaring, David's men are winning. Then verse 18 says, now the three sons of Zeruiah were there, and they're listed, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now, by the way, I learned something this week. Yes, even the pastor doesn't know everything about the Bible. I learned that Zeruiah is not a man, but a woman. Zeruiah is actually the sister of David. So that makes Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, by the way, good guys, it makes them David's family. Now, I know this is a little dated, but these guys are to David what Huey, Dewey, and Louie were to Donald Duck. They were nephews, but they were annoying. And they make all kinds of mess that their uncle has to clean up. All right? And in this story, they have David's back, but they don't have David's faith. They have David's loyalty, but they don't have David's patience. So they rush off to try to deal with this thing on their own. And it says in verse 18 that Asahel, one of them, was swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. He was Israel's Usain Bolt, if you will. In fact, I learned this morning, Josephus, the Jewish historian, I don't know if this is true, Josephus says that Asahel could outrun a horse. Last time I checked, they could run like 30 miles an hour, so I don't know if that's true or not. But nevertheless, this guy was fast. And he starts chasing Abner. And Abner asks him, he confirms, is that you behind me? And he says, verse 20, it is. And then verse 21, Abner said to him, turn to the right or to the left and take hold of one of the young men for yourself and take for yourself his spoil. Now talk about a jerk move. Abner says, don't kill me, kill one of the interns. Take one of those guys, if you will. He literally says, leave me alone and knock it off. But Asahel doesn't. He tells him to stop, but Asahel just keeps running. He keeps pursuing. He keeps going. So verse 22, Abner repeated again, turn aside from follow me. Why should I strike you to the ground? But Asahel, verse 23, refused to turn aside. He keeps running. He keeps going. He keeps pursuing. He keeps making his way in this direction. And so Abner feels and knows that he's closing in on him, so he has to do something. So he takes his spear and holds it out. In verse 23, he struck him in the belly with the butt into the spear so that the spear came out at his back. First of all, gross. But second of all, important. Why is it important? I don't think Abner was trying to kill him. I think he was trying to knock the wind out of him. The point of the story is that Asahel was so fast, he was running so fast, he impaled himself on the spear. So what's the author showing us? That Asahel was running when he should have been stopping. He was pursuing when he should have been patient. If only he had slowed down, if only he had listened, he would not have died. You see, we might miss this lesson, but Israel did not. Look at the end of verse 23. And it came about that all who came, this is talking about later in time, all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, what did they do? They stood still. They did the thing that Asahel should have done. They did the thing that everyone in this story should have done. They did the thing that David was doing, standing still. How often does our impatience breed recklessness? We start to panic. I have to have this thing right now. And like Asahel, we get tunnel vision. And we won't listen to reason. We won't listen to wisdom. We won't listen to the red flags that other people are trying to show us. And we get fixated on our own pursuits and our own timetable. Proverbs 14 says, he who is hasty in spirit reveals his own foolishness. Have you ever shown yourself a fool by being so impatient? I imagined as the spear was plunged into his stomach and Asahel fell to the ground, that he looked up at the night sky and saw the same stars that Abraham saw and thought to himself, if only I had waited. With Asahel dead, his two brothers pick up the hot pursuit. Verse 24, Joab and Abishai, good guys, keep pursuing Abner, the bad guy. Abner gets to the high ground, and he has some men join him from Benjamin, that's Saul's tribe, and they call down to Joab, and they say, hey, let's make a truce. Let's not do this. He seems to regret what's happening now that he sees this thing unraveling. In verse 26, Abner called to Joab and said, shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know it will be bitter in the end? He can see where this thing is going, and it's not good. And so in a moment of clarity, Joab listens to reason. And verse 28, so Joab blew the trumpet, and look at this, and all the people, literally in Hebrew, stood still. They halted. They stopped running. They stopped pursuing, because that's the thing that they were doing, but that's the thing they shouldn't have been doing. And while the chase is over, the story is not. Verse 30 tells us that Joab returned, and they counted up the body count on David's side, 20 men in total. They counted up the body count on Abner and Ishbosheth's side. Verse 31, 360 men died. In some ways, the message is too little, too late. The damage is done. They now need 380 body bags. They have to write 380 obituaries. Parents have to dig 380 graves for their children. And then to show us how bad this impatience is, notice verse 32. And they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which is in Bethlehem. Then look at this, verse 32. Then Joab and his men went all night until the day dawned, where? At Hebron. Do you see the point? The story ends where it began. As if the author is saying, none of this had to happen. Nobody had to die. Nobody had to be speared through. No parent should have had to grieve. This entire story was pointless. We're now back to where we started at Hebron, which is the place we should have been in the first place. If only we had waited on the Lord at Hebron. Brothers and sisters, are you content to wait on the Lord at your Hebron? I don't know where you are in life right now. Some of you are at very different places, but we all know that itch. We all know that restlessness. We all know that impatience inside of us that wants to trust our own understanding and to go where we want. Some of you young people, you singles, you may be impatient about your singleness. You see other people getting engaged or getting married and you feel left out. And you know that you should marry in the Lord, but you're up all night on the app trying to find just anybody. And your friends are saying, you know you shouldn't do that. And you go, yeah, but I like a project. I can fix a man or I can fix a woman. And you just do this. Why? Because you're convinced you can bring your domestic kingdom into fruition. My friend, God's kingdom cannot be forced, but grasped by force. It has to be received by faith. And you don't want to wake up 30 years down the road and think, if only I had waited. Are you impatient about graduation? About your unemployment? About childlessness? About sickness? That your life isn't going as you thought and you find yourself feeling this? My friend, all of that, it stems from impatience. The good news is God not only calls us away from our impatience, but through what Christ has done, He delivers us from our impatience. He cleanses us from our impatience and our discontentment, so that we get to the point that we can say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I am content in Him. That's why Jesus came. That's why He died. That's why He rose, to grant us life and a relationship with God that is all satisfying, and we don't run off in impatience. You know, the book of Isaiah says, those that wait upon the Lord shall what? Renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. Which means there is a time to run, but only after the time that you've waited. They wait on the... Are you waiting on the Lord? Are you willing to submit your timetable to God's? And say, God, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know where this is going. But Lord, I'm going to write all my plans in pencil and give you the eraser. You're in charge. As David, Lord, shall I